Every conscious creature on this planet is built to hurt. That is not a poetic claim, but a fact about neural architecture, effective processing, and evolutionary design. And yet, the question of why we suffer remains, after thousands of years of philosophy, stubbornly unsettled. Not because we lack theories, but because the question fractures the moment you press on it. Ask a neuroscientist and you will hear about nociceptors, C fibers, and anterior cingulate activation. Ask a Buddhist monk and you will hear about craving, impermanence, and the construction of a false self. Ask a moral philosopher and you will hear about the asymmetry between pleasure and pain, and whether suffering has any justifying purpose. Ask a phenomenologist and you will hear that suffering is not one thing at all, but a cluster of phenomena whose unity we assume too quickly. Each of these answers captures something real, and none of them is complete. The reason they are not complete is not disciplinary narrowness alone. It is that suffering sits at the intersection of consciousness, selfhood, time, evolution, value, and social structure. Pull on one thread and the others move. This series reconstructs the problem of suffering from its foundations. We will begin with a distinction that nearly everyone gets wrong, the distinction between pain and suffering. From there, we will confront the hardest question in consciousness science, which is not why experience exists, but why it comes with a charge. We will trace the evolutionary pressures that shaped phenomenal hurt, ask whether suffering requires a self, and discover that time itself is a constitutive ingredient of what makes suffering suffering. We will then engage with the most sophisticated non-Western diagnosis of suffering's engine ever produced. We will confront cases that seem to break every theory we have built, cases of voluntary and even sought-after suffering. And we will ask the question that many philosophers avoid because they have no clean answer to it. Could suffering be eliminated entirely? And if so, at what cost? That is the first half. The second half will deal with the moral, existential, and structural dimensions of the problem. Why does suffering seem to matter more than pleasure? Can it ever be justified? Does it constitute meaning or merely accompany it? And how much of the suffering we observe is produced not by the structure of consciousness, but by the structure of societies? No part of this series will end with a neat resolution. Every part will end where the actual problem ends, which is at an open question that the best minds in the field are still working on. The goal is not to answer why do we suffer, but to show you exactly where and how the question resists answering. Let us begin with the fracture. Part 1. The fracture between pain and suffering. Most people use the words pain and suffering interchangeably, and for everyday purposes that works well enough. But this conflation conceals a philosophical distinction that is load-bearing for everything that follows. Here is the common-sense picture. You put your hand on a hot stove, you feel a sharp burning sensation, and you suffer. The suffering seems to be the pain, or at least to ride on top of it so tightly that no gap between them is thinkable. Pain is the bad feeling. Suffering is the having of it, and the two are fused. This picture is intuitive, widely shared, and wrong. The evidence that it is wrong comes from a rare neurological condition called pain asymbolia. Patients with pain asymbolia, typically resulting from lesions in the insular cortex, report something that should be impossible on the common-sense view. They feel pain. They can locate it precisely on their bodies. They can discriminate between sharp and dull, between mild and intense. They can tell you they are in pain. But they do not care. They do not flinch, do not withdraw, do not show distress. When pricked to the point of drawing blood, one patient told the examining clinician it did not hurt. Nicola Grahek's careful analysis of the clinical literature identified pain asymbolia as the only clean case of what he calls pain without painfulness. The sensory discriminative dimension of the pain experience remains intact, meaning the patient still receives and processes information about bodily damage. What is absent is the affective motivational dimension, the part that makes pain matter to the person experiencing it. The patient detects the noxious stimulus but has no aversive response to it. Colin Klein has pushed this analysis further by interpreting pain asymbolia as a kind of depersonalization for pain. On his reading, and on Philip Gerrans' more recent neurocomputational account, the patient still registers pain as occurring in their body. What they have lost is the sense that the pain belongs to them, the phenomenal mindness that normally anchors nociceptive information to the self-model. The pain is happening in their body, but it is not phenomenologically theirs. This is why they smile when pricked, why they watch their own hand being burned with the detachment of someone observing a mildly interesting experiment. Now, here is the philosophical payoff. If pain and suffering can come apart, then they are not the same thing. Pain is a localized bodily episode, a signal about tissue damage or its threat. Suffering is something else entirely. Olivier Massin has argued that pain and suffering are categorically distinct. Pain is localized, suffering is not. Pain has a specific bodily address, a throbbing in the left knee or a burning on the right palm. Suffering has no such location. You cannot point to the part of your body where your grief resides. Massin's positive thesis is that suffering is a non-localized affective attitude, something more like an emotional orientation toward an experience than the experience itself. This distinction matters immediately for a question you may not have thought to ask. Can you suffer without pain? The answer is obviously yes, and we all know this from experience. A person sitting in a quiet room receiving a cancer diagnosis over the phone is in no physical pain at all. Their nociceptors are silent, their C fibers are quiescent. Yet their suffering may be among the worst they will ever endure. Grief, humiliation, betrayal, existential dread, the slow erosion of purpose in chronic depression. None of these require any nociceptive input whatsoever. Colin Klein's imperativist theory treats this asymmetry seriously. He proposes that pain issues first-order imperatives, essentially commands from the body to solve a problem involving bodily integrity. Suffering, by contrast, operates as something like a second-order state, one that takes the first-order sensation as its object and responds to it with a demand that it cease. On this architecture, pain is a signal, and suffering is a stance toward a signal, or toward any experience that the organism evaluates as intolerable. This is why you can suffer from things that are not painful, and why you can be in pain without suffering. But here is where the picture gets genuinely complicated. and where the textbook treatment usually stops one step too early. Griffith and Kind published a provocative challenge in 2024, arguing that pain asymbolia is not actually pain at all. Their claim is that the clinical literature on asymbolia is far messier than philosophers have assumed. Cases are rare, often confounded by co-occurring deficits like aphasia, and the testimony of patients may not mean what Grahek and others have taken it to mean. If Griffith and Kind are right, the philosophical edifice built on asymbolia stands on a shaky empirical foundation. Klein's direct response in 2025 defends the standard interpretation, arguing that asymbolia qualifies as a genuine neuropsychological dissociation regardless of rarity or associated deficits. But even Klein concedes that the debate about how to classify asymbolia cannot be separated from the debate about how to define pain in the first place. If pain is defined as requiring unpleasantness, then, by definition, asymbolics are not in pain, and the dissociation vanishes. If pain is defined by its sensory discriminative features, then the dissociation holds. The empirical evidence does not settle the matter, because the matter is partly conceptual. What this debate reveals is that even the first step in understanding suffering, the attempt to distinguish it from pain, immediately runs into a tangle of phenomenology, neuroscience, and conceptual analysis that resists clean resolution. And the hardest question has not even been raised yet. We have established that suffering has an affective character, a felt badness that goes beyond sensory detection. But we have said nothing about why felt badness exists at all. Why does any experience come charged with a positive or negative valence? That is the hard problem not of consciousness, but of valence itself. Part 2. The Hard Problem of Valence. David Chalmers made the hard problem of consciousness famous by asking why physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience at all. Why is there something it is like to see red rather than mere information processing in the dark? That question has dominated philosophy of mind for 3 decades and remains open. But there is a harder question underneath it, one that bears directly on suffering, and it has received far less attention than it deserves. The harder question is this: why does experience come with valence? Grant, for the sake of argument, that physical processes produce subjective experience. That still does not explain why some of those experiences feel good and others feel terrible. A complete functional account of the brain's information processing could, in principle, explain why an organism detects tissue damage, withdraws its limb, and learns to avoid the source. None of that requires the experience to hurt. A system could do all of this while being, from the inside, perfectly neutral about what was happening to it. This is the hard problem of valence, and it is distinct from the hard problem of consciousness in a way that matters. Chalmers's original problem asks why there is experience at all. The valence problem asks why experience is polarized, why it comes divided into states that matter to the subject positively or negatively. You can conceive of a being that has rich phenomenal experience, that sees colours and hears melodies, but for whom none of it carries any effective charge. Chalmers himself has used the thought experiment of a Vulcan, a conscious creature with no affect whatsoever, to probe this exact boundary. Such a being would have consciousness without valence. The significance of this thought experiment has been sharpened in recent work on the moral status of consciousness. Valence sentientism is the position that what matters morally about consciousness is specifically its affective dimension, the capacity to feel pleasure and to suffer. On this view, consciousness without valence, the Vulcan's inner life, may be phenomenologically rich but morally weightless. You cannot wrong a being that cannot be harmed or benefited by what happens to it. But Chalmers has pushed back, and others have followed. Broad sentientism holds that consciousness in general, not just affective consciousness, is morally significant. Killing a Vulcan would still be monstrous, Chalmers argues, because you are ending a conscious life, a subject with a point of view. The recent literature shows that even philosophers sympathetic to valence sentientism find themselves pulled toward the broader view when they sit with the Vulcan case long enough. This debate matters for understanding suffering because it forces a question about what valence actually is. If valence is what makes consciousness morally significant, and if it is also what constitutes the sufferingness of suffering, then we need a theory of it. And here the options are surprisingly thin. One family of theories treats valence as representational content. On these views, a painful experience represents bodily damage as bad, and the badness is part of what the experience is about. David Bain has developed an evaluativist account along these lines, arguing that pain's unpleasantness consists in its representing bodily conditions as bad for the subject. The appeal of this approach is that it makes valence a kind of perception, a detection of something real in the world, specifically the disvalue of tissue damage. The problem is that this approach struggles with cases where the valence seems to float free of any representable object. Consider existential dread, the diffuse sense that everything is wrong without any particular thing being wrong. Or consider the low-grade suffering of chronic depression, which often persists in the absence of any identifiable harmful stimulus. These states have powerful negative valence, but no clear representational content about bodily or worldly damage. They are suffering without a target, and representational theories have difficulty accounting for them. A competing family treats valence as a desire-like state. On the desire theory, pain hurts because you want it to stop, and the wanting constitutes the unpleasantness. This handles pain asymbolia elegantly. The asymbolic patient detects the nociceptive stimulus but lacks the second-order desire for it to cease. No desire for cessation, no unpleasantness. But the desire theory has its own difficulty, which is that it seems to get the direction of explanation backward. You do not dislike your pain because you want it to stop. You want it to stop because it is already unpleasant. The unpleasantness seems to come first, and the desire follows from it. Murat Aydade and Matthew Fulkerson have tried to thread this needle with an adverbialist proposal. On their view, pain does not have unpleasantness as a separable component, whether representational or desire-based. Rather, the pain is experienced unpleasantly, where unpleasantly modifies the mode of experiencing rather than identifying a distinct mental state. This dissolves the problem of which comes first, the feeling or the attitude, by denying that they are separable in the first place. The cost is that it makes valence resistant to decomposition, which means it resists the kind of mechanistic explanation that neuroscience trades in. Meanwhile, in computational neuroscience, work on valence partitioned reinforcement learning has shown that the brain processes appetitive and aversive information through parallel but independent pathways. Reward prediction errors and punishment prediction errors are generated separately, converging only downstream in regions like the ventral striatum and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Kenneth Kishida and colleagues have demonstrated that these distinct learning signals predict not only behavioral choices but also moment-to-moment subjective reports of how outcomes feel. This means Valence at the neural level is not a single dimension but a composite of at least two independent streams. This finding creates a problem for every philosophical theory of valence, because all of them assume that the goodness or badness of an experience is a single property, even if they disagree about what kind of property it is. If the neural reality is partitioned, then the unified feeling of this hurts may be a construction assembled from components that can, in pathological cases, dissociate. Which is exactly what we see in pain asymbolia. We are left with a picture in which Valence, the thing that makes suffering suffering, is neither well explained by current theories of consciousness nor cleanly captured by the leading philosophical accounts of affect. We know it is there. We know it matters more than almost anything else in ethics and in lived experience. And we do not have a theory of it that survives scrutiny. The felt badness of suffering remains for now a brute phenomenal fact that we can describe, correlate with neural activity, and fail to explain. That failure matters because the next question is evolutionary. If we cannot explain why valence exists, can we at least explain what it is for? The capacity for phenomenal hurt was not free. It cost metabolic energy and neural real estate. Natural selection does not maintain expensive features without a reason. So, what function does the felt awfulness of suffering serve that mere information processing could not? Part 3. The evolutionary riddle of phenomenal hurt. The standard evolutionary story about pain is straightforward and mostly correct. Pain signals tissue damage, motivates withdrawal, promotes learning, and improves survival. An organism that cannot feel pain will burn its hand off on a fire, walk on a broken leg until the bone fragments, and fail to learn which foods are toxic. Congenital insensitivity to pain is a real condition, and the people who have it suffer constant injuries, infections, and dramatically shortened lifespans. So the capacity for pain is clearly adaptive. But this story answers the wrong question. It explains why nociception is useful, why the detection of tissue damage and the behavioral responses it triggers improve fitness. Nociception is an information processing function, and functions are exactly the kind of thing that standard evolutionary explanations handle well. What this story does not explain is why nociception hurts. Why does the information processing come packaged in a phenomenal experience of awfulness? An organism could detect damage, withdraw from threats, and modify its behavior through purely unconscious mechanisms. Mechanisms that process all the same information without any felt character whatsoever. This is the epiphenomenalism worry applied specifically to affect. If you could build a nociceptive system that does everything pain does, functionally, without generating any subjective experience of hurting, then the phenomenal component is causally idle. If it is causally idle, natural selection cannot see it, and it cannot be selected for. Jerry Fodor put the point bluntly. Phenomenal consciousness might not be for anything at all. One response is to deny the premise and insist that phenomenal experience does causal work that functional processing alone cannot do. Jaak Panksepp argued this throughout his career, claiming that affective consciousness provides a unique form of motivation that no unconscious system could replicate. On Panksepp's view, the felt quality of pain is not a decoration on top of a withdrawal reflex. It is the motivational force that makes the reflex count. Without the phenomenal awfulness, the system would lack what he called affective consciousness, and the behavior would be mechanical response without genuine caring. The recent multidimensional dynamical theory of consciousness, developed in work published through the Royal Society in 2025, pushes this idea further. It proposes that phenomenal consciousness was originally selected to signal the approximate adaptive value of internal and external states to a subject. But then something unexpected happened. Once phenomenal states took on this intrinsic valuation role, they became themselves the targets of behavior. Organisms stopped pursuing reproductive fitness directly and started pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain as proximate goals. This triggered what the theory describes as a runaway evolutionary process, analogous to sexual selection, in which increasingly sophisticated control mechanisms evolved to manage the pursuit and avoidance of felt states, sometimes at the cost of reproductive fitness itself. This is a striking claim because it makes suffering not merely a useful signal, but an independent evolutionary force. The capacity for phenomenal hurt, once it arose, reshaped the organism's behavioral economy in ways that natural selection did not initially intend. Animals do not avoid predators because they compute survival probabilities. They avoid predators because being caught hurts, and the anticipation of pain is itself aversive. The phenomenal awfulness of suffering became the currency in which biological trade-offs are denominated. A complementary but distinct hypothesis comes from Kolodny, Moyal and Edelman, who proposed in 2021 that the evolutionary function of pain's phenomenal character is related to honest signaling. Inspired by Amos Zahavi's handicap principle, they suggest that felt suffering serves as an upfront cost imposed on the organism to make its learning signals credible. The idea is that a signal which is cheap to produce can be gamed. A signal that genuinely hurts cannot. Pain's phenomenal awfulness ensures that the learning signals the brain generates about threats are not just informative but costly, which makes them honest in the game-theoretic sense. But both of these evolutionary accounts face a deep objection, and it is the same objection. They assume that phenomenal experience does causal work, that the feeling of pain adds something that mere functional processing lacks. This assumption cannot be tested directly because we have no way to build a functionally identical system without phenomenal experience and compare the two. The zombie thought experiment, a being physically identical to you but with no inner experience, is a conceptual tool precisely because it is empirically impossible. Every evolutionary account of phenomenal suffering rests on an assumption about consciousness's causal efficacy that the philosophy of mind has not settled. There is a further problem specific to suffering as opposed to consciousness in general. Richard Dawkins made the observation in passing that there is no evolutionary pressure to stop the pain of a dying prey animal. A gene that tranquilized a gazelle at the moment a lion's jaws closed on its throat would serve no reproductive purpose, because the gazelle's genes are about to be removed from the population regardless. This means that some suffering, perhaps a great deal of it, exists not because it was selected for, but because there was no selection pressure against it. It is, in evolutionary terms, noise, a side effect of a system built for other purposes, persisting because its elimination would cost something without providing any reproductive benefit. Randolph Nesse has developed an evolutionary medicine framework for understanding this asymmetry. The capacity for pain is what natural selection shapes, not pain itself. And that capacity, once it exists, will inevitably produce suffering in circumstances where it serves no function. Phantom limb pain, chronic pain long after an injury is healed, the pain of grief over losses that cannot be reversed. These are not adaptive responses but misfirings of a system whose design parameters were set for a different environment. This leaves us with a picture in which evolution can explain why we have the capacity for suffering, but cannot fully explain why any particular episode of suffering occurs or persists. The machinery was built for a purpose, but the machinery runs in contexts its designers never anticipated. And even the purpose for which it was built, phenomenal motivation, rests on an unresolved assumption about whether experience does anything that unconscious processing could not. There is still a deeper question lurking here that evolution cannot touch. Even if suffering requires phenomenal consciousness, and even if phenomenal consciousness requires a subject, does it require a self? A unified, persisting entity that owns the suffering and is diminished by it? Or can suffering occur in a system with no self at all, just a flow of affective experience with nobody home to have it? Part 4. Suffering and the Self. Take any episode of intense suffering, a toothache, a panic attack, crushing regret, and ask who is suffering. The natural answer is, I am. Suffering seems to require an owner, a subject to whom the experience belongs and from whose perspective it is endured. Without a self to be wounded, there is nothing for the pain to happen to. This looks like a truism, but it is precisely the kind of truism that philosophy exists to interrogate. Thomas Metzinger's self-model theory of subjectivity offers the most developed framework for this interrogation. On Metzinger's account, no such thing as a self exists in the world. Nobody ever was or had a self. What exists is a phenomenal self-model, a continuously updated representation the brain generates of its own states and deploys for self-regulation. This model is transparent in Metzinger's technical sense, meaning the system cannot experience the model as a model. It mistakes the representation for the thing represented. You feel like a self because your brain is running a self-simulation that it cannot see through. 3 phenomenal properties constitute the self-model. Mineness is the sense of ownership, the feeling that this experience is mine. Perspectivalness is the sense of occupying a single point of view, being the centre from which the world is perceived. And selfhood is the sense of temporal continuity, being the same subject over time. Together, these properties produce the first-person perspective, the feeling that there is someone it is like to be. Now apply this framework to suffering. If the self is a model and not an entity, then the one who suffers is also a model and not an entity. This creates a philosophical vertigo. Suffering certainly seems to require a sufferer, but Metzinger's view is that the sufferer is itself a construction, an artifact of the brain's self-modeling process. The suffering is real, the phenomenal experience is genuine, but the thing we take to be the subject of that experience is, on Metzinger's analysis, a useful fiction. Pain asymbolia becomes newly instructive here. Remember that Klein interpreted asymbolia as depersonalization for pain, a loss of mindness for nociceptive experience. The patient still registers pain in their body but does not experience it as belonging to them. On Metzinger's framework, this amounts to a localized breakdown in the self-model. The nociceptive information is processed but not integrated into the phenomenal self. The pain exists but has no owner, and without an owner there is no suffering. Philip Gerrans developed this connection explicitly in 2020 using the framework of interoceptive active inference. On his account, the sense of mindness for pain is produced by the anterior insular cortex, which integrates nociceptive signals with the ongoing self-model to produce the feeling that this pain is happening to me. In pain asymbolia, insular hypoactivity disrupts this integration. The result is pain without personalization, nociception without the selfward orientation that would make it suffering. This analysis suggests a strong thesis. Suffering requires not just consciousness and not just valence, but the attribution of the valenced experience to a self-model. No self-model, no suffering. This is not the same as saying no self, no suffering, because on Metzinger's view, the self-model is always already a fiction. What it says is that suffering requires the fiction to be running. It requires the system to be in the grip of the transparent self-model, experiencing its states as belonging to someone. The Buddhist resonances here are unmistakable and have not been lost on Metzinger himself. The Buddhist claim that suffering arises from attachment to a self that does not ultimately exist maps onto Metzinger's claim that suffering depends on a transparent self-model that is ontologically nobody. But the philosophical implications diverge. Buddhist soteriology says that seeing through the illusion of self can extinguish suffering. Metzinger's framework raises the question of whether that is neurologically possible in any robust sense, or whether the transparency of the self-model is a feature so deeply embedded in the system's architecture that it cannot be overcome while the system remains conscious. There is a counter-argument to the strong thesis, and it deserves to be felt at full strength. Consider an infant, a very young one, perhaps only weeks old, who is clearly in distress from a painful medical procedure. Does this infant have a self-model in Metzinger's rich sense? Does it have mindness, perspectivalness, and selfhood? Metzinger himself acknowledges that a minimal phenomenal self-model may exist even in very simple organisms. But the question is whether the full self-model, with its temporal continuity and narrative structure, is necessary for suffering, or whether something much simpler will do. If suffering can occur with only a minimal self-model, then the connection between suffering and robust selfhood is weaker than the strong thesis suggests. Suffering might require only the most basic attribution of valence to a phenomenal subject, something closer to raw ownership than to narrative identity. This would mean that creatures without anything like a human self, but with some rudimentary sense of bodily mindness, can suffer. The ethical implications of this are enormous, and still being worked out in the literature on animal consciousness and artificial sentience. What remains clear is that suffering is not a simple sensation, but a structured phenomenon that involves, at minimum, valenced experience and some form of self-attribution. Disrupt the self-attribution, and you get pain without suffering. Disrupt the valence, and you get experience without caring. But there is yet another dimension that we have barely touched. Suffering does not happen in an instant. It unfolds in time. And the way it unfolds in time is not incidental to what it is, but constitutive of it. Part 5. The Temporal Architecture of Suffering. A sharp, instantaneous pain, a needle prick lasting half a second, is barely suffering at all. You wince, the sensation passes, and you move on. Now hold that same sensation steady for an hour. The phenomenal quality of the stimulus has not changed, but the experience has been utterly transformed. Something has happened that cannot be captured by any description of the sensation's intrinsic character. What has happened is that time has entered the structure of the suffering. Husserl's analysis of time consciousness provides the essential tools here. For Husserl, the present moment is never a bare point, but always an extended structure with three components. Primal impression is the awareness of what is happening right now. Retention is the awareness of what has just passed, still held in consciousness as just past, rather than recalled from memory. And pretension is the anticipatory awareness of what is about to happen, experienced not as an explicit prediction, but as a felt orientation toward the immediate future. Apply this structure to pain, and the consequences are immediate. When you are in sustained pain, your present moment is not just the current sting. It includes the retentional awareness of the pain that was there a moment ago, which was itself retaining the pain before that, creating a receding chain of retained suffering that thickens the present with accumulated hurt. Simultaneously, pretension projects the pain forward. You feel, preconceptually, that the next moment will also contain pain. The present moment of suffering is therefore always thicker than the present moment of a painless experience. It carries its own past and future within it. Christian Grueny and more recently phenomenologists working in the Merleau-Ponty tradition have argued that chronic pain does something even more radical to temporal experience. It totalizes the present. In ordinary consciousness, pretension is relatively open and indeterminate. The next moment could bring any number of things. In chronic pain, pretension narrows. The anticipated future is colonized by the expectation of continued pain, which means the future as a space of possibility contracts. The phenomenological literature describes this as a collapse of lived time. The sufferer is trapped in an extended present that admits no meaningful future. A person with a migraine that has lasted for 3 days provides a vivid case. They lie in a dark room. They know intellectually that the migraine will end, that it has ended before. But their lived temporal experience does not have this knowledge embedded in it. Pretensionally, each moment opens onto another moment of pain. The future is not open. It is pre-filled with suffering. This is why chronic pain patients frequently report that time seems to slow down or to become static. The phenomenal elongation of the present is not a metaphor, but a structural feature of how consciousness constitutes time under conditions of sustained negative valence. Elaine Scarry made an observation that cuts across both the phenomenological and the psychological literature. The suffering of pain is closely related to the belief or conviction that it will persist without end. This conviction is partly given by pain itself, intrinsic to its phenomenology, in the sense that pain makes the experience of duration slow and become static, and it is partly imposed through ongoing interpretations of the experience. Scarry's point is that the endlessness of suffering is not something the sufferer adds to the experience through pessimistic thinking. It is something the experience imposes on the sufferer through its distortion of pretensional awareness. Now, here is the critical philosophical move. If time is constitutive of suffering, not merely a container in which suffering occurs, then much of what we call suffering is actually a temporal phenomenon disguised as a qualitative one. Take two experiences with identical sensory discriminative character, the same intensity, the same location, the same type of pain. Give one a clear endpoint that the subject can anticipate and leave the other open-ended. The second will be dramatically worse, not because the sensation is worse, but because the temporal structure is different. Pretension in the first case includes the approaching cessation. Pretension in the second does not. This is not speculative philosophy. Neuroscientific research on temporal expectation and pain modulation confirms it directly. When subjects are told that a painful stimulus will end at a known time, their reported pain intensity drops significantly compared to an identical stimulus with no announced endpoint. The sensory input is the same. What changes is the temporal framing, which changes the pretensional structure of the experience, which changes the suffering. Heidegger's analysis of temporality adds another layer. For Heidegger, Dasein, the being that we are, is fundamentally futural. We exist primarily as beings who project ourselves toward possibilities. Suffering, on a Heideggerian reading, is the condition in which this futural projection is blocked. The sufferer cannot project toward meaningful possibilities because the present is dominated by what cannot be escaped. This is why depression, even without physical pain, is such profound suffering. It is the collapse of the futural dimension of existence, the inability to care about what comes next. The temporal constitution of suffering explains something that purely qualitative accounts cannot. It explains why anticipation of pain is often worse than the pain itself, why dreading a dental procedure for 2 weeks produces more total suffering than the procedure does. The anticipation is not a separate event added to the pain. It is suffering that is generated entirely by pretensional consciousness operating under threat. The pain has not begun, but the suffering has, because pretension has already filled the future with it. It also explains why memory transforms suffering retroactively. Daniel Kahneman's distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self shows that our retrospective evaluation of a painful experience is dominated by its peak intensity and its ending, not by its duration. A colonoscopy that ends with a long, mild period of discomfort is remembered as less painful than a shorter one that ends abruptly at high intensity. The suffering as recalled is a different object from the suffering as lived, because memory reconstitutes the temporal structure. All of this leads to a claim that I think is underappreciated even in the specialist literature. Suffering is not a sensation to which time is added. Suffering is a temporal phenomenon through and through. Its retention, its pretension, its duration, its anticipated endlessness, its relationship to the future as a space of possibility. These are not external features of the experience, but internal constituents of it. Change the temporal structure, and you change the suffering itself, even if nothing about the sensory stimulus has changed. But if suffering is constituted partly by time and partly by the self-model, we still have not asked what drives the system to generate suffering in the first place. The evolutionary account told us about nociception's adaptive value. The temporal account told us about suffering's phenomenal structure. Neither has told us about the engine of suffering, the mechanism within the mind that generates dissatisfaction, craving and aversion on an ongoing basis, even when no external threat is present. For that, we need to engage with the deepest and most systematic diagnosis ever offered of suffering's inner workings. Part 6. Desire, Attachment, and the Engine of Dukkha. The Buddhist analysis of suffering begins with a claim that is easy to state and surprisingly difficult to refute. The claim is that suffering is caused not by what happens to you, but by the mind's response to what happens to you. Specifically, the mind responds to experience with craving, which is the Pali term tanha, literally thirst. It is tanha that generates dukkha, and without tanha, dukkha ceases. This is the second noble truth, and its philosophical content is far more precise than most Western treatments acknowledge. Start with dukkha itself, because the translation matters, and most translations are wrong. Early Western translators rendered dukkha as suffering, which captures only one layer of the concept. The term is likely derived from dustha, meaning standing badly or unsteady, conveying not agony, but a pervasive instability, an existential unease that pervades all conditioned experience. Contemporary scholars increasingly prefer to leave the term untranslated or to gloss it as unsatisfactoriness. Buddhist texts distinguish three forms of dukkha, and the distinctions are philosophically load-bearing. Dukkha is the suffering of obvious pain, physical and mental. This is the kind of suffering we have been analyzing in the preceding parts. Viparinama dukkha is the suffering that comes from change, specifically the suffering that arises when pleasant experiences end. And sankhara dukkha is the most subtle form, the background unsatisfactoriness that pervades all conditioned experience simply because all phenomena are impermanent, dependently arisen, and without fixed essence. The philosophical force of this taxonomy is in the third category. Sankhara dukkha is not a reaction to any particular event. It is a structural feature of conditioned existence itself, given how the mind relates to that existence. Even when everything is going well, even when pleasure is present and pain is absent, there is an undercurrent of unease that Buddhist psychology attributes to the mind's fundamental misapprehension of reality. The mind treats phenomena as permanent, as possessing fixed essences, and as belonging to or reflecting a stable self. Because none of these things is true, the mind's orientation toward experience is perpetually out of alignment with what experience actually delivers. Tanha The craving that drives this misalignment comes in three varieties. Kama-tanha is craving for sensory pleasure. Bhava-tanha is craving for continued existence, for being. Vibhava-tanha is craving for non-existence, for annihilation. This last form is crucial and often overlooked. The desire to not exist, to escape, to be done with it all, is itself a form of craving, and therefore itself a source of suffering. There is no exit from dukkha through wishing for extinction, because the wishing is itself tanha. Now the question is whether this analysis holds up when examined with the tools of contemporary philosophy of mind. And the surprising answer is, much of it does, though not in the terms Buddhists themselves would use. Consider the predictive processing framework that has come to dominate computational neuroscience. On this view, the brain is fundamentally a prediction engine that generates models of incoming sensory data and updates those models based on prediction errors. Positive prediction errors, things going better than expected, generate positive affect. Negative prediction errors, things going worse, generate negative affect. The system is built to minimize prediction error, which means it is built to reduce surprise. But here is the key point. A system that is constantly trying to reduce surprise is a system that is constantly in a state of potential dissatisfaction, because the world is always more surprising and more changeable than the model can capture. This maps onto dukkha with unsettling precision. The brain's predictive models treat the world as more stable and more controllable than it is. When reality deviates from the model, negative affect arises not because anything is objectively wrong, but because the prediction was wrong. The craving for things to be as the model predicts them to be is structurally analogous to tanha. And the pervasive, low-grade dissatisfaction that arises because the world never quite matches the model is structurally analogous to sankhara dukkha. Rick Hanson, working at the intersection of Buddhist psychology and neuroscience, has drawn these connections explicitly. He argues that much suffering arises not from craving in the folk sense of desperately wanting something, but from what he calls the visceral sense that needs are unmet, that something is missing or something is wrong. This sense is generated by the predictive system's detection of a gap between its expectations and incoming reality. It persists even when all basic needs are met because the system's set point for enough is continually recalibrated upward. But here is where the Buddhist analysis faces its strongest philosophical challenge. The Buddhist claim is that the cessation of tanha is possible through insight into impermanence and non-self, and that this cessation is nirvana. The predictive processing framework suggests something much more pessimistic. The system's drive to minimize prediction error is not a cognitive error that can be corrected, but a fundamental feature of the architecture. You cannot opt out of prediction error any more than you can opt out of having a brain. The most you can do is modulate the system's precision expectations, its confidence in its own predictions, which meditation may accomplish to some degree. But the engine of dissatisfaction, the tanha-like drive to close the gap between model and world, keeps running as long as the system is conscious. This tension between the Buddhist promise of cessation and the neuroscientific picture of inescapable prediction error is one of the most interesting unresolved questions in the cross-disciplinary study of suffering. Contemplative traditions report that advanced practitioners achieve states of equanimity that appear to be genuine reductions in the affective charge of experience. Neuroimaging data shows that long-term meditators have reduced default mode network activity, which is associated with self-referential processing and mind-wandering, the very activities that generate much of Sankhara Dukkha. But whether this constitutes a cessation of tanha or merely a modulation of its intensity is a question that neither the contemplative tradition nor neuroscience has answered definitively. What the Buddhist analysis does provide, and what no Western theory has matched, is a systematic account of why suffering persists even in the absence of any external cause. The engine is internal. It is the mind's own craving, aversion, and misapprehension of its objects. The question that this part cannot answer, but that the next part raises, is what to make of cases where the relationship between suffering and craving reverses entirely, where the organism seeks out suffering willingly and seems to find something valuable in it. Part 7. The Paradox of Voluntary Suffering. A marathon runner at mile 22 is in severe pain. Their legs are burning with lactic acid, their feet are blistered, their breathing is ragged. They could stop at any moment. Nobody is forcing them to continue. Yet they push harder, seeking out the very suffering that every theory we have examined says organisms are built to avoid. And if you ask them afterward whether they regret it, many will say it was among the most meaningful experiences of their lives. This is not an edge case or a curiosity. Voluntary suffering is ubiquitous in human life. The musician practicing a difficult passage until their fingers bleed, the surgeon enduring years of brutal residency training, the meditator sitting motionless through waves of physical agony during a 10-day silent retreat. In each case, suffering is not merely tolerated, but actively pursued. The common-sense explanation is instrumental. They suffer now for a reward later. But this explanation is inadequate, and its inadequacy reveals something deep about suffering's relationship to value. Ralph Ellis, a philosopher who ran competitively for decades, has argued that the instrumental explanation fails because it cannot account for the phenomenology of voluntary suffering during the activity itself. Long-term reward cannot explain why the runner at mile 22, in the moment of maximal distress, often reports not a grim endurance, but a heightened sense of aliveness. Something is happening within the suffering, not merely after it, that the pleasure-pain calculus cannot capture. Ellis's diagnosis draws on Panksepp's affective neuroscience to argue that what motivates voluntary suffering is not the pleasure system at all. It is the play system, a distinct neural circuit that generates its own intrinsic rewards, independent of pleasure or pain. The play system is activated by challenge, novelty, and the exertion of mastery under difficulty. It can operate simultaneously with the pain system, which means the organism can be in genuine distress and in a state of intrinsically motivated engagement at the same time. These are not contradictory states that cancel each other out. They are parallel systems running concurrently. This neurobiological picture maps onto a philosophical point that R.M. Hare made decades earlier in a passage that philosophers of pain rarely engage with. Hare noted that mild pains in uncomplicated circumstances do not hurt in any morally significant sense. You can draw a needle lightly across your skin, identify the sensation as pain, and truthfully report that you do not dislike it. Children induce dizziness in themselves deliberately. Nobody calls this masochism. The point is that the connection between pain and suffering is not as tight as the common-sense view assumes, and that in contexts of voluntary engagement, the affective valence of a painful experience can be genuinely transformed, not merely overridden. Benign masochism, a term coined by psychologist Paul Rosin, describes the enjoyment of initially negative experiences that the brain recognizes as posing no genuine threat. The realization that the pain is safe, that it will not cause lasting harm, triggers a reversal in which the body's response to the noxious stimulus is experienced as pleasurable. Eating extremely hot chili peppers, riding roller coasters, watching horror films, these are all instances of the same mechanism. The sensation remains aversive at the sensory discriminative level, but the organism's contextual evaluation transforms the affective motivational dimension. Now, here is the philosophical problem that this evidence creates. Every theory of suffering we have examined identifies suffering with negative valence. Suffering is the felt badness of an experience. But voluntary suffering cases show that an experience can retain its painful character while losing or even reversing its felt badness in context. If the marathon runner is in pain but not suffering, or is suffering but finding the suffering valuable, then either the definition of suffering needs revision, or the relationship between negative valence and disvalue is more complex than standard theories allow. The Stanford Encyclopedia's recent treatment of the paradox of tragedy captures the issue in its most refined form. The paradox is that we seem to want to suffer, that we voluntarily undergo experiences with negative affective valence and find them enriching. One response is that the suffering is merely a means to a separable end, the pleasure of catharsis or the satisfaction of achievement. But this response does not explain Hume's deeper puzzle. The positive value seems to be explained by the suffering, not merely caused alongside it. Remove the suffering from a tragic opera, and you do not get the same value minus some pain. You get a fundamentally different and diminished experience. From an evolutionary perspective, the willingness to undergo costly suffering may function as an honest signal of the agent's commitment or capacity. A person who endures significant pain for a goal demonstrates that the goal matters enough to them to pay a high price, which is information that cannot be cheaply faked. This connects back to the Zahavian analysis from Part 3. Suffering's awfulness is precisely what makes the signal credible. If it did not genuinely hurt, the signal would be worthless. But none of these explanations resolves the core tension. Suffering is supposed to be intrinsically bad, the thing we should want to eliminate. Yet human beings consistently create, seek, and retrospectively endorse experiences of suffering. If suffering were merely instrumentally bad, bad only because of its downstream effects, this would be easy to explain. Sometimes bad processes produce good outcomes. But most theories of suffering claim it is intrinsically bad, bad in itself, regardless of its consequences. Voluntary suffering is a standing challenge to that claim, and no theory has fully absorbed its implications. This challenge connects directly to the next question. If suffering is not always and intrinsically bad, then could it be eliminated entirely? Would we even want it to be? The proposal that suffering can and should be abolished, that future technology might excise it from the human condition altogether, is not science fiction. It is an active philosophical and scientific program, and its strongest version has implications that most people, once they see them clearly, find deeply unsettling. Part 8. The Eliminability Thesis. David Pearce's hedonistic imperative, first published in 1995 and continuously revised since, makes a claim that most people initially dismiss and then find harder to refute than they expected. The claim is that suffering is a solvable engineering problem. Genetic engineering, pharmacology, and neurotechnology could, in principle, recalibrate the hedonic set point of every sentient being so that the entire range of experience shifts upward. You would still have gradients of well-being, still prefer some experiences to others, still be motivated to act. But the bottom of the scale would no longer include suffering as we know it. The worst you would ever feel would be less good, never genuinely bad. This is the eliminability thesis in its strongest form, and the reason to take it seriously is not that the technology is imminent, but that the philosophical objections to it are weaker than they initially appear. Start with the most common one, that suffering is necessary for motivation. Without the stick of pain, we would not avoid dangers, strive for goals, or care about anything. This objection assumes that motivation requires negative affect, that you need to feel bad in order to be moved to act. But the neuroscience of motivation does not support this. The dopaminergic seeking system operates on anticipated reward, not anticipated punishment. Organisms with intact seeking circuits but suppressed pain circuits can still be motivated, curious, and goal-directed. Motivation may require differential valence, a gradient from less good to more good, without requiring that any point on the gradient feels bad. The second common objection is that suffering is necessary for knowledge. Michael Brady has developed this argument in sustained detail in his Suffering and Virtue, contending that suffering serves an epistemic function. Pain captures attention, and sustained suffering forces a kind of cognitive engagement with its causes that pleasure-driven attention does not. A person who loses a loved one and grieves deeply may come to understand something about human attachment and mortality that a person who never grieves cannot access. On Brady's view, suffering is not just accidentally correlated with learning. It is constitutively linked to certain forms of understanding. This is the strongest objection, and it deserves to sit without resolution for a moment. If Brady is right, then eliminating suffering would not just remove a negative experience. It would close off entire domains of knowledge. There would be truths about the human condition that post-suffering beings literally could not grasp, not because they lacked information, but because the knowing requires the suffering. Harvey Carroll and Ian James Kidd have pushed this further with the concept of suffering as a transformative experience, arguing that some forms of understanding are only available through undergoing experiences that fundamentally alter the subject's perspective. You cannot know what it is like to face death without facing it, and the knowledge that comes from facing it requires the suffering that facing it produces. The eliminativist has a response, and it is not trivial. Concede that suffering produces some forms of knowledge. Then ask whether those forms of knowledge are worth the price. The total amount of suffering experienced by all sentient beings on this planet at any given moment is beyond calculation. The vast majority of it produces no knowledge, no growth, no virtue. A rabbit dying slowly from myxomatosis gains no wisdom from its agony. A child with a terminal illness who cannot understand what is happening to them is not being educated by their pain. The cases where suffering plausibly produces irreplaceable knowledge are a tiny fraction of the total suffering that exists. Defending suffering in general, because it is sometimes epistemically useful, is like defending house fire in general, because it sometimes clears deadwood. There is a deeper version of the objection that does not depend on the consequences of suffering at all. This version says that a life without the possibility of suffering would be a diminished life, not because suffering teaches us things, but because the capacity for suffering is constitutive of the kind of being we are. A creature that cannot suffer cannot fully love, because love requires vulnerability to loss. It cannot be courageous, because courage requires the possibility of fear and pain. It cannot experience the full depth of beauty, because beauty is partly constituted by its transience and the ache of its passing. On this view, to eliminate suffering is not to improve the human condition, but to abolish it and replace it with something else, something that might be pleasant but would no longer be recognizably human. The eliminativist will call this status quo bias, the tendency to valorize existing conditions simply because they are familiar. Our ancestors might have made the same argument about eliminating smallpox. Disease builds character. Immunity through survival is more meaningful than immunity through vaccination. A world without plague would be spiritually impoverished. We now recognize these arguments as rationalizations produced by people who had no alternative. The eliminativist suggests that our attachment to suffering is the same, not a deep philosophical insight, but a coping mechanism dressed up as wisdom. Metzinger has entered this debate from an unexpected angle with his argument for a global moratorium on synthetic phenomenology. His concern is not with eliminating human suffering, but with creating new forms of it. As artificial intelligence systems become more complex, the risk of accidentally creating systems capable of phenomenal suffering increases. Metzinger argues that the creation of artificial suffering would be ethically catastrophic, and that the precautionary principle requires a moratorium on any research that might produce it. The implication is that Metzinger, the philosopher who argued that no selves exist, takes the existence of suffering so seriously that he is willing to constrain the entire field of artificial intelligence to prevent its unnecessary production. This highlights an asymmetry at the heart of the eliminability debate. Almost everyone agrees that creating unnecessary suffering is wrong. But there is nothing close to consensus on whether eliminating existing suffering would be good. The disagreement is not about empirical facts. It is about what kind of existence is worth having. And that question cannot be settled by neuroscience, evolutionary theory, or phenomenology alone. It requires a theory of value, and more specifically, a theory of whether suffering's disvalue is absolute or conditional. Does suffering always make things worse, regardless of context? Or does its disvalue depend on what it makes possible, what it reveals, what it constitutes? The paradox of voluntary suffering from Part 7 already showed that at least some suffering is endorsed by the sufferer as valuable. The Eliminability thesis forces the question of whether this endorsement is evidence that suffering can be good, or merely evidence that human psychology is prone to rationalizing its own afflictions. We are not going to resolve this here because it is genuinely unresolved. What we can do is name the precise fork in the road. If suffering's disvalue is intrinsic and absolute, then the eliminability thesis is correct, and the only question is feasibility. If suffering's disvalue is context-dependent and partly constitutive of goods that cannot exist without it, then elimination is not an improvement, but a transformation into something whose value we cannot assess in advance. The next set of parts will take up what rides on this fork: the moral weight we assign to suffering, the question of whether it can be justified, and its relationship to the structure of meaning itself. Part 9. Hedonic Adaptation and its Failures. In 1978, Brickman Coates and Janoff Bullman published one of the most famous studies in happiness research. They compared the life satisfaction of recent lottery winners with that of people who had become paraplegic through accidents. The headline finding was that the lottery winners were not significantly happier than controls, and that the accident victims were not as unhappy as one would expect. Both groups, it seemed, had returned toward a baseline level of well-being. This was taken as powerful evidence for hedonic adaptation. The idea that human beings have a happiness set point, largely determined by genetics and temperament, to which they inevitably return after the disruption of life events. The philosophical implications of this finding, if it holds, are staggering. If adaptation is complete and inevitable, then suffering is always temporary, and the project of reducing it is a kind of Sisyphean exercise. Every intervention, whether pharmacological, social or psychological, would produce only transient relief before the set point reasserts itself. On this picture, the hedonic treadmill ensures that we are always running and never arriving, that improvements in life, circumstances translate into brief spikes of well-being, followed by a return to the baseline. The hedonic treadmill has been enormously influential in policy discussions, economics, and philosophy. It appears to provide empirical support for the Buddhist diagnosis of sankhara dukkha, the background unsatisfactoriness that pervades all conditioned existence. No matter what you achieve, the treadmill returns you to where you started. The machinery of craving, as Part 6 described it, has a neuroscientific correlate in the recalibration of hedonic baselines. But the original finding was wrong, or at least seriously overstated. The 1978 study had only 29 lottery winners, 22 paralyzed accident victims, and 22 controls. It was cross-sectional, meaning it captured people at a single point in time rather than tracking them longitudinally, and its measures of well-being were crude. When Diener, Lucas and Skollen revisited the adaptation hypothesis in 2006, drawing on large-scale longitudinal panel data from Germany and other countries, they identified 5 revisions that the treadmill model urgently needed. First, individual set points are not hedonically neutral. Most people are mildly positive at baseline. Second, people have different set points, and these differ partly based on temperament. Third, a single person may have multiple set points: pleasant emotions, unpleasant emotions and life satisfaction can move in different directions independently. Fourth, and most significant, set points can change under certain conditions. And fifth, individuals differ enormously in the extent to which they adapt to events. Some people fully adapt to divorce or widowhood within a few years. Others show permanent shifts in well-being. Richard Lucas's longitudinal studies are particularly damaging to the strong adaptation thesis. He found that long-term disability is associated with lasting decreases in life satisfaction that do not recover even after many years. Unemployment produces similar lasting effects. Widowhood shows partial but incomplete adaptation, meaning bereaved individuals recover somewhat, but many never return to their pre-loss baseline. The treadmill, it turns out, has different speeds for different events and different people, and for some combinations it barely moves at all. This creates a problem for both optimists and pessimists about suffering. For the optimist who says suffering is always temporary, the data show otherwise. Some forms of suffering produce permanent reductions in well-being with no full adaptation. Chronic pain, disability, and certain kinds of loss leave lasting marks on the hedonic landscape. The system does not always reset. For the pessimist who says the treadmill makes all efforts to reduce suffering futile, the revised data are equally challenging. If set points can change, then interventions to raise them are not necessarily doomed. The question becomes which interventions for which kinds of suffering in which individuals can produce lasting change. And that is an empirical question, not a philosophical one, which means the debate about the eliminability of suffering from Part 8 cannot be settled from the armchair. There is a deeper philosophical lesson in the asymmetry of adaptation. People adapt much more readily to positive events than to negative ones. The lottery winner's thrill fades faster than the accident victim's despair. This negativity bias, the tendency for negative experiences to weigh more heavily than positive ones and to resist adaptation more stubbornly, is one of the most robust findings in affective science. It suggests that the hedonic system is built not for happiness, but for vigilance. That evolution designed us to return quickly from joy to baseline while lingering in suffering because suffering signals threats that demand sustained attention. Jamie Meyerfeld called this the moral asymmetry of happiness and suffering, and he drew from it a normative conclusion. The imperative to reduce suffering is stronger than the imperative to increase happiness. If adaptation erodes the gains from happiness-promoting interventions more quickly than it erodes the harms of suffering, then the marginal utility of reducing suffering exceeds the marginal utility of increasing pleasure. This has implications for everything from healthcare allocation to global development priorities. But all of this analysis rests on self-reports of subjective well-being, and self-reports introduce a problem that the next part must confront directly. When a paralyzed person reports acceptable life satisfaction, does that mean they are not suffering? Or does it mean they have recalibrated their expectations? When an animal writhes and vocalizes in response to a noxious stimulus, does that mean it is suffering the way a human suffers? Or is behavior an unreliable guide to phenomenal experience? How do we know what anyone else is feeling? And how much does our answer to that question change our moral obligations? Part 10. The epistemic problem of other suffering. You can know your own suffering with the kind of certainty Descartes attributed to the cogito. If you believe you're in pain, you are in pain. There is no gap between the experience and the knowledge of it. But when you look at another person writhing on the ground, or a dog yelping after being stepped on, or a fish thrashing on a hook, your knowledge is of a fundamentally different kind. You are making an inference, and inferences can be wrong. The problem of other minds has been a staple of epistemology since Descartes, but its application to suffering has a special urgency because of what rides on getting it right. If we are wrong about which beings can suffer, we are either inflicting unrecognized cruelty on beings that feel, or we are constraining our behavior for the benefit of beings that feel nothing. The stakes are not merely theoretical, they determine the scope of the moral community. Thomas Nagel's 1974 paper on the bat established the framework within which this debate still operates. Nagel simply assumed that there is something it is like to be a bat, that bats have phenomenal experience, and then argued that we cannot know what that experience is like because the bat's sensory modalities are too different from our own. The distribution question, as later philosophers have called it, is even more basic. Can we know which organisms are conscious at all? Nagel did not engage with this question because he found the answer obvious for mammals. But the further we move from mammals, the less obvious it becomes. Peter Carruthers has argued that if higher-order thought is required for phenomenal consciousness, then most animals lack it, and their apparent pain behaviors are produced by unconscious processing. On his view, the dog that yelps is not in pain in any morally relevant sense. It is executing a nociceptive reflex without any accompanying subjective experience. Carruthers acknowledges that this conflicts with widespread intuition, but argues that the intuitions are unreliable, partly because we are cognitively disposed to over-attribute mental states to anything that behaves in familiar mammalian ways. Dennett has pushed this skepticism further by demonstrating how easily we attribute consciousness to simple robots designed to move at mammalian speeds in mammalian patterns. The robot cog, he argued, triggers our folk psychological attribution systems effortlessly, which shows that those systems cannot be trusted as guides to the actual distribution of consciousness. The opposing view, defended by perceptualists like Gallagher and Zahavi, is that our attributions of mental states to animals are not inferences from behavior to hidden inner states, but a kind of direct perception. When you see a dog in distress, you do not construct an argument from analogy. You see the distress in roughly the way you see the colour of its fur. This perceptual access to the mental states of others may be fallible, but it has a default epistemic authority that skeptical arguments should not be able to override without powerful countervailing evidence. The New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness in 2024, signed by a large group of scientists and philosophers, reflected a growing consensus that the evidence for consciousness in mammals and birds is strong, and that it should not be dismissed on the basis of philosophical arguments about the theoretical possibility of unconscious information processing. The Declaration also acknowledged emerging evidence that consciousness may extend to fish, cephalopods, and possibly some insects, though the evidence becomes thinner as we move further from vertebrates. For the problem of suffering specifically, the epistemological challenge has a feature that the general problem of other minds does not. With consciousness in general, we might be comfortable with some degree of uncertainty. With suffering, the moral stakes create an asymmetry in the cost of error. If we wrongly attribute suffering to a fish and restrict our treatment of it accordingly, the cost is some inconvenience to human practices. If we wrongly deny suffering to a fish and subject billions of them to treatment that in fact causes agony, the cost is an ethical catastrophe of immense scale. This asymmetry of error costs has led many ethicists, including Jonathan Birch, to argue for a precautionary principle. Where there is credible uncertainty about an organism's capacity for suffering, we should err on the side of protection. The problem intensifies as artificial intelligence systems grow more complex. When a large language model outputs text describing its own suffering, what epistemic weight should we give to that output? We have no theory of consciousness adequate to determine whether any physical system is conscious, let alone whether it suffers. Metzinger's call for a moratorium on synthetic phenomenology, mentioned in Part 8, reflects the seriousness of this gap. We may be creating suffering in systems that cannot tell us they suffer, or we may be attributing suffering to systems that produce sophisticated mimicry of distress without any phenomenal experience at all. We cannot currently distinguish between these possibilities. The epistemic problem of other suffering is not a theoretical curiosity, but an active constraint on our moral reasoning. Every claim about the moral weight of suffering, every policy designed to reduce it, every judgment about whose suffering matters and how much presupposes an answer to the question of who is suffering and how badly. And that question, for any being other than oneself, is one we cannot answer with certainty. We act as if we can, because the alternative, treating every apparent sufferer as potentially a philosophical zombie, is morally intolerable. But the gap between our moral confidence and our epistemic warrant is wider than most ethical discussions acknowledge. With this epistemological caution in place, we can now turn to the moral question that depends on it. Given that we believe others suffer, how much moral weight should that suffering carry? And does it carry the same weight regardless of who is suffering, or does context change everything? Part 11. The Moral Weight of Suffering. Jeremy Bentham's famous formulation placed suffering at the foundation of ethics. The question is not whether they can reason, nor whether they can talk, but whether they can suffer. This claim, deceptively simple, carries a philosophical commitment that is far from trivial. It says that the capacity for suffering is what grants a being moral status, and that this capacity is both necessary and sufficient for moral consideration. No suffering, no moral standing. Suffering, moral standing. This is the core of what is now called sentientism, and in its strong form it has a radical implication. If a being suffers, then its suffering counts morally, regardless of its species, intelligence, social relationships, or usefulness to us. A pig in a factory farm and a professor in a university both suffer, and their suffering weighs on the moral scale by virtue of being suffering, not by virtue of who is doing it. Peter Singer's effective altruism movement and the global animal welfare movement are both, at bottom, applications of this principle. But the moral weight question is not settled by Bentham's principle alone, because the principle says nothing about how to weigh different instances of suffering against each other. Is an hour of mild headache in a human morally equivalent to an hour of mild headache in a mouse? Is the suffering of a being with a rich autobiographical self, who can remember past suffering and anticipate future suffering, worse than the suffering of a being with only present moment consciousness? Our analysis from parts 4 and 5 suggests it might be, since the temporal architecture of suffering and the self-model that anchors it are partly constitutive of what makes suffering suffering. A being with a richer self-model and a more extended temporal horizon may suffer in ways that are structurally more complex, which could translate into greater moral weight. But this reasoning is dangerous, and its danger is not hypothetical. Historically, every attempt to rank the moral weight of suffering by the sophistication of the sufferer has been used to justify the exploitation of those deemed less sophisticated. Colonial powers denied the full moral weight of colonized people's suffering on the grounds that their inner lives were less rich. The same logic has been applied to animals, to children, to people with cognitive disabilities. The claim that suffering's moral weight varies with the cognitive sophistication of the sufferer, even if metaphysically defensible, is ethically treacherous because of how reliably it is abused. The alternative is what we might call flat sentientism. All suffering counts equally, unit for unit, regardless of the cognitive sophistication of the sufferer. A minute of agony is a minute of agony, whether it occurs in a human or a chicken. This view has the virtue of being exploitation-resistant, but it has its own problems. It implies that the suffering of billions of insects, if insects can suffer, could easily outweigh the suffering of all humans combined, which would demand a radical reorientation of our moral priorities. Most people find this conclusion implausible, which either means our moral intuitions need revising or the flat view is wrong. Jamie Meyerfeld's work on the moral asymmetry between happiness and suffering introduces another dimension. Meyerfeld argues that suffering has greater moral weight than the corresponding amount of happiness, not because of some arbitrary weighting, but because of an asymmetry in the phenomenology itself. Intense suffering is worse than the loss of intense pleasure. The worst pains are further from the hedonic neutral point than the best pleasures. If this is correct, then moral calculation should give disproportionate weight to the prevention and alleviation of suffering relative to the promotion of happiness. This asymmetry maps onto what we found in the hedonic adaptation literature from Part 9. People adapt more readily to positive events than to negative ones, which means the disvalue of suffering is more persistent than the value of pleasure. The practical implication is that $1 spent reducing suffering produces more lasting well-being than $1 spent increasing happiness. This is not a claim about the metaphysics of value, but about the empirical structure of the hedonic system, and it has been increasingly influential in effective altruism and global health prioritization. There remains a question that all of these views struggle with, and it is the question Emmanuel Levinas placed at the center of his ethics. Levinas argued that the suffering of the other person is not a datum to be weighed and calculated, but a demand that confronts me with infinite obligation. To encounter another's suffering is to be called to responsibility in a way that cannot be captured by any utilitarian calculus. The face of the suffering other does not present me with a unit of disvalue to be summed and compared. It presents me with an ethical command that precedes all calculation. Levinas's position is sometimes dismissed as merely emotional or theological, but it identifies a genuine difficulty for any aggregative approach to the moral weight of suffering. When you sit with a dying person, the thought that their suffering is one unit of disvalue among billions does not capture what is happening morally. Something about the particularity of this suffering, its being undergone by this person in this moment, seems to matter in a way that aggregation misses. Whether this intuition reflects a deep truth about the structure of moral obligation or merely the limitations of human moral cognition is a question the tradition has not resolved. What it has established, however, is that suffering generates moral claims of some kind on those who can perceive it. The next question is whether those claims can ever be satisfied by an explanation, whether suffering can be justified by the goods it produces or the purposes it serves. Part 12. The Justification Problem. The attempt to justify suffering is as old as philosophy itself, and no version of it has succeeded. That is a strong claim, so let me make it precise. What I mean is not that no one has offered a reason why suffering might serve a purpose. Many have, and some of those reasons are compelling. What I mean is that no one has produced an argument that justifies the amount, the distribution, and the character of suffering that actually exists. The classical attempt comes from theodicy, the effort to reconcile the existence of suffering with the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God. The most sophisticated version is Leibniz's. This is the best of all possible worlds, and the suffering in it is the minimum required for the maximum total good. Every instance of suffering is either necessary for a greater good that could not have been achieved without it, or it is necessary to prevent a greater evil. The problem with this view is not that it is logically inconsistent, but that it requires us to believe something extraordinary about every specific instance of suffering. The bone cancer in a child, the slow death of a starving animal, the suffering of a person with treatment-resistant depression who endures decades of continuous anguish. Each of these must be the minimum suffering necessary for the best possible world. Even Karamazov's challenge in Dostoevsky's novel remains the most powerful articulation of why this is morally unacceptable. Karamazov does not deny that universal harmony might require suffering. He says he refuses to accept a harmony built on the tears of a single tortured child. Secular theodicies fare no better. The claim that suffering builds character, the soul-making theodicy developed by John Hick, has the same structural problem. Granting that some suffering builds character in some people, it is flatly obvious that much suffering destroys character, breaks people, and produces nothing of value. The mother who watches her child die slowly does not emerge with a better soul. She emerges shattered, and any philosophy that calls her shattering a form of growth has confused itself with a self-help book. Levinas attacked the Justification project root and branch in his essay on useless suffering. His central claim was that suffering can be meaningful in me, but must be regarded as useless in the other. I may find meaning in my own suffering through the way I respond to it, the courage or compassion it generates. But I am never entitled to find meaning in your suffering, because to do so is to instrumentalize you, to treat your agony as raw material for my moral or spiritual improvement. Levinas saw the entire project of theodicy as an obscenity, an attempt to make suffering palatable by assigning it a purpose that consoles the observer rather than the sufferer. The secular version of this challenge targets any consequentialist justification of suffering. Suppose a policy causes intense suffering to a small number of people, but produces moderate benefits for a very large number. Cost-benefit analysis says the policy is justified if the total benefits exceed the total harms. But this treats suffering as fungible, as a quantity that can be compensated by a sufficient quantity of benefit distributed elsewhere. The person who suffers is not made better off by the diffuse benefits to others. Their suffering remains their suffering, undiminished by the happiness of strangers. The rights-based tradition in ethics, from Kant through to contemporary deontologists, resists this fungibility. On a Kantian view, to impose suffering on a person as a means to some end, even a beneficial end, is to violate their dignity. The person is being used, and the use is impermissible regardless of the goodness of the outcome. But even deontological ethics struggles with cases where failing to impose a small amount of suffering allows a much larger amount to occur. The trolley problem and its countless variants are exercises in this difficulty, and they have not produced consensus because the underlying question, whether suffering can be justified by its consequences, is one on which moral intuitions genuinely conflict. There is one position that cuts through the justification problem entirely, and it is the position examined in Part 8, that suffering need not be justified because it can be eliminated. If suffering is a solvable engineering problem, then the question of whether it serves a purpose becomes moot in the way that the question of whether smallpox serves a purpose became moot once we could eradicate it. But as we saw, the eliminability thesis depends on contested assumptions about what would be lost if suffering were removed. If suffering is partly constitutive of goods like love, courage, and deep understanding, then eliminating it is not an engineering victory but a metaphysical transformation whose value cannot be assessed in advance. The justification problem remains, I think, genuinely unresolved. We can say with confidence that most suffering is not justified by its consequences, that no theodicy survives contact with the actual distribution of suffering in the world, and that the attempt to justify another person's suffering is morally suspect. But whether all suffering is unjustifiable, whether there are no cases in which suffering is a necessary condition of a good that could not exist without it, is a question to which the next part is devoted. Part 13. Suffering and the Constitution of Meaning. The claim that suffering constitutes meaning, rather than merely accompanying it, is one of the most contested ideas in the philosophy of value. The distinction is crucial. If suffering merely accompanies meaning, like a fee you pay for entry to an otherwise independently valuable experience, then in principle the fee could be waived without loss. But if suffering constitutes meaning, if it is partly what makes the meaningful thing the thing it is, then removing it would not preserve the meaning minus the cost, but would destroy the meaning itself. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy is often cited here, but Frankl's actual position is more subtle than the popular version suggests. Frankl did not claim that suffering is meaningful. He claimed that meaning can be found in suffering, which is a different and weaker thesis. Finding meaning in suffering is a psychological capacity that some people exercise and others do not, and its exercise does not depend on suffering being intrinsically meaningful. It depends on the human ability to adopt a stance towards suffering that transforms its significance for the sufferer. The stronger constitutive claim comes from a different direction. Consider the experience of grief after the death of someone you love deeply. This grief is not a tax levied on the love. It is the love itself, experienced under conditions of irreversible loss. To love someone and be invulnerable to grief at their death would not be love in any sense we recognize. The grief is what the love feels like when the beloved is gone. It is constitutive of the love, not a separable byproduct of it. If this is correct, then eliminating the capacity for grief would not preserve love while removing its downside. It would transform love into something else, something that cannot be wounded by loss, and that transformation would be a fundamental change in what the relationship is. The Eliminability thesis from Part 8 encounters its most formidable obstacle here, because the claim is not that suffering teaches us something about love, which would be merely instrumental, but that suffering is partly what love consists of under certain conditions. Harvey, Carroll and Ian. James Kidd's work on suffering as transformative experience pushes this further. A transformative experience is one that changes the subject in ways that cannot be predicted or understood from the pre-transformation standpoint. The person who has survived a life-threatening illness knows something about mortality, about the texture of each ordinary day, about the weight of time, that the person who has not survived such an illness literally cannot understand, because understanding it requires having been transformed by it. The knowledge is not propositional. It is constituted by the experiential transformation itself. This creates a philosophical problem for cost-benefit analysis of suffering. If suffering produces transformations whose value can only be assessed from the post-transformation standpoint, then any pre-transformation assessment of whether the suffering is worth it is epistemically defective. You cannot know whether the grief was worth it until you have grieved, and once you have grieved, you are a different person, assessing from different values. The decision calculus breaks down because the decider is changed by the very thing being decided about. The counter-argument, and it is a strong one, is that this constitutive claim is too easily generalized. Many things we now recognize as unambiguously bad were once thought to constitute meaning. Ritual sacrifice, the honor of dying in battle, the nobility of stoic endurance under oppression. Each of these involved suffering that was considered constitutive of culturally valued goods. We now regard most of these as cases where meaning was attributed to suffering by people who had no alternative to it. The suspicion is that the constitutive claim is always a rationalization, a story we tell ourselves to make bearable what we cannot change. Nietzsche sits uncomfortably at the center of this debate. His claim that what does not kill you makes you stronger is universally known and almost universally misunderstood. Nietzsche did not endorse suffering as a path to health. He recognized that suffering mostly destroys. What he argued was that the rare individual who can metabolize suffering, who can take their wounds and forge from them a more powerful mode of existence, represents a human possibility that should not be foreclosed. The Nietzschean concern with the elimination of suffering is not that it would remove something valuable, but that it would remove the conditions under which a certain type of excellence becomes possible. Simone Weil offers a darker and more honest analysis. For Weil, suffering is not ennobling, but destructive. It strips away the self's pretensions and exposes the person to a reality that is, in her word, affliction. Affliction is suffering so severe that it attacks the soul itself, not just the body or the emotions. But while thought this destruction was, paradoxically, the condition under which genuine attention to reality becomes possible. The afflicted person, stripped of self-deception, can see what the comfortable person cannot. This is not a justification of suffering, but a description of what suffering makes epistemically available, and while was clear that the price is far too high for any rational calculus to endorse. The question of whether suffering constitutes meaning cannot be answered in general because it depends on what we mean by meaning itself. If meaning requires narrative coherence, then suffering may be constitutive of it, because narrative coherence requires difficulty, loss, and transformation. If meaning is a matter of objective value independent of narrative, then suffering's constitutive role is less clear. What is clear is that human beings consistently report that their most meaningful experiences are also among their most painful ones, and that this correlation is not easily explained away as mere rationalization. There is a position that bypasses this entire debate by arguing that the question of meaning is the wrong frame for evaluating suffering. This position asks not whether suffering is meaningful, but whether bringing beings into existence who will inevitably suffer can ever be justified. It challenges the assumption that meaning, however constituted, compensates for the fact that the sufferer did not consent to exist in the first place. Part 14. The Asymmetry of Existence and Non-Existence. David Benatar's asymmetry argument is the most internally disciplined case for the conclusion that coming into existence is always a harm. The argument turns on 4 claims, arranged in a matrix. The presence of pain is bad. The presence of pleasure is good. The absence of pain is good, even if there is no one to enjoy that absence. The absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is someone who is deprived of it. The asymmetry between the third and fourth claims is doing all the philosophical work. When you decide not to have a child, no one is deprived of pleasure because there is no one who exists to be deprived. But the absence of that child's potential pain is still a good thing. Non-existence gets the benefit of absent pain without paying the cost of absent pleasure, because the cost of absent pleasure only registers if someone exists to feel the deprivation. Therefore, non-existence is preferable to existence from the standpoint of the would-be person. Benatar supports this axiological asymmetry by pointing out that it explains several widely shared moral intuitions. We have a strong duty not to bring suffering children into existence, but no corresponding duty to bring happy children into existence. We feel compassion for distant populations that are suffering but do not grieve the absence of happy populations on uninhabited planets. We can regret bringing someone into existence for their sake, but cannot coherently regret not bringing someone into existence for their sake, because in the latter case there is no there to speak for. The objections to Benatar's argument are numerous, and some are powerful, but none has achieved consensus as a refutation. The most common response is to reject the asymmetry directly. If the absence of pain is good, then the absence of pleasure should symmetrically be bad, even when no one exists to feel the deprivation. A universe devoid of all pleasure is a worse universe than one containing it, regardless of whether anyone in the pleasureless universe feels deprived. Benatar responds that this is a logical claim, but his asymmetry is axiological, concerning values rather than logical necessity, and that insisting on symmetry would undermine the very intuitions that the asymmetry was introduced to explain. De Grazia and Metz have challenged Benatar's distinction between a life worth starting and a life worth continuing. Benatar argues that these are two different standards. A life can be worth continuing, once begun, without having been worth starting. This is because once you exist, the absence of the pleasures you would lose by ceasing to exist is a deprivation, since you now exist to be deprived. But before you exist, the absence of those pleasures is not a deprivation, because there is no you. Critics ask why we should accept this asymmetry, and the debate turns on whether person-affecting principles in population ethics, principles that evaluate outcomes only by their effects on identifiable individuals, are correct. Fumitake Yoshizawa argued in 2021 that even granting all of Benatar's premises and intuitions, the antinatalist conclusion does not follow in its universal form. A more limited local antinatalism, holding that it is wrong to create lives that are guaranteed to be predominantly miserable, follows from the same premises without requiring the global conclusion that all procreation is harmful. This is because the asymmetry, if it works at all, works most powerfully for the worst lives and most weakly for the best ones. Massimo Pigliucci has attacked the hedonistic foundations of Benatar's argument entirely, arguing from a Stoic perspective that pleasure and pain are not the only bearers of prudential value. If virtue, relationships and engagement with the world contribute to well-being independently of their hedonic tone, then a life containing significant suffering might still be objectively good in ways that the pleasure-pain matrix cannot capture. Benatar's response is that anyone who denies pain is intrinsically bad, does not understand what pain is. The asymmetry argument matters for our investigation not because antinatalism is the right answer to the question of why we suffer, but because it exposes an asymmetry in the moral logic of suffering that all positions must confront. The asymmetry is this. The badness of suffering does not require justification by its consequences because it is bad in itself, whereas the goodness of pleasure does not generate an obligation to produce it. This is not Benatar's invention. It is an intuition that most ethical frameworks share, even those that reject his conclusion. The question is what to do with it. If suffering's badness is self-justifying in the sense that it makes moral claims on us without needing to be redeemed by any further good, then the response to suffering is always to reduce it, and the question of whether it serves a purpose is, morally speaking, secondary. But if some suffering is constitutive of goods that cannot exist without it, as Part 13 argued, then the relationship between suffering's intrinsic badness and its role in constituting value is genuinely paradoxical. Something can be intrinsically bad and constitutive of something intrinsically good, and this is not a contradiction but a feature of the moral landscape that defies simple resolution. Up to now, our analysis has focused on suffering as an individual phenomenon, as something that happens inside individual conscious subjects. But a great deal of the suffering in the world is not produced by the structure of consciousness, by evolutionary design, or by the nature of time. It is produced by institutions, economies, and the organization of social power. And that kind of suffering requires a different kind of analysis. Part 15. The structural production of suffering. A migrant labourer working in extreme heat for 12 hours a day, earning barely enough to eat, suffering chronic back pain, anxiety about deportation, and the grief of separation from children they may not see for years, is not suffering because of the structure of consciousness or the nature of evolutionary design. They are suffering because of wage structures, immigration laws, global labour markets, and the distribution of political power. Their nociceptors and affective systems work the same way as anyone else's. What differs is the conditions under which those systems are activated, and those conditions are social, economic, and political. This is the domain of what we might call structural suffering, and it is one that philosophical treatments of suffering often neglect in favour of the metaphysical, phenomenological, and ethical questions we have examined so far. The neglect is itself a philosophical problem, because a theory of suffering that cannot account for the way social structures produce, maintain, and distribute suffering is radically incomplete. Marx's analysis of exploitation provides the foundational framework here, though updated considerably by subsequent work in political philosophy and sociology. Marx argued that the capitalist mode of production generates suffering not as a side effect but as a structural feature of the system. Workers suffer because the extraction of surplus value requires that they be paid less than the value of what they produce, which means their needs are systematically underfunded by the system that depends on their labour. This is not the suffering of natural scarcity, but the suffering of artificial deprivation within a system capable of meeting everyone's needs. The relevance of this analysis to the philosophy of suffering is that it identifies a category of suffering whose explanation is sociological rather than psychological or metaphysical. The Buddhist analysis from Part 6 locates the engine of suffering in the mind's craving and aversion. The evolutionary analysis from Part 3 locates it in the design of the nociceptive system. The structural analysis locates it in the organization of production, distribution, and political power. These are not competing explanations. They operate at different levels. A person can suffer because of tanha, and because of wage exploitation, and because of the temporal structure of chronic pain, all simultaneously. But the structural analysis adds something the other levels cannot provide, an account of why suffering is distributed the way it is. Why do some people suffer vastly more than others? The metaphysics of consciousness does not explain this. Everyone has roughly the same neural architecture. The evolutionary account does not explain it. The capacity for suffering is species-wide. What explains the distribution is social structure. Who has power, who controls resources, whose interests are served by the institutional arrangements that produce and maintain specific patterns of suffering. Iris Marion Young's concept of structural injustice is valuable here. Young argued that injustice can be produced by the normal operations of institutions in which no single actor intends to cause harm. The suffering of the migrant labourer is not caused by any one person's cruelty, but by the interlocking logic of labour markets, immigration policy, consumer demand, and trade agreements. No one decided to make this person suffer, but the system operates in a way that makes their suffering almost inevitable. This creates a moral problem that individual ethics cannot solve, because the suffering is produced by structures, not individuals, and it can only be addressed by changing structures, not reforming characters. Paul Farmer, working at the intersection of medicine and political philosophy, coined the term structural violence to describe the suffering that is produced by social arrangements that systematically disadvantage certain groups. Poverty, racism, gender-based oppression and colonial legacies produce suffering that is as real and as severe as any suffering produced by disease or injury. But its causes are invisible in a way that disease causes are not. A broken bone has a visible cause. The suffering of chronic poverty has causes that are distributed across institutions, policies, and historical processes that no single observer can see in their totality. The philosophical implication is that the Eliminability thesis from Part 8 has a political dimension that the hedonic engineering approach neglects. David Pearce's proposal to recalibrate the hedonic setpoint through biotechnology would not touch the structural production of suffering. You could give everyone a pharmacologically elevated baseline of well-being and still have a world in which some people's structural conditions impose suffering that the elevated baseline cannot compensate for. A person forced to work in dangerous conditions for inadequate pay is not suffering from a miscalibrated hedonic set point. They are suffering from a correctly calibrated system responding to genuinely harmful conditions. Raising their set point without changing their conditions would be a form of sedation, not liberation. This connects to a concern that critical theorists have raised about mindfulness and contemplative practices. If the Buddhist analysis is correct that craving drives suffering, then meditation can reduce individual suffering by modulating the mind's reactive patterns. But when meditation is deployed in workplaces as a tool for helping employees cope with exploitative conditions, it functions as an instrument of structural maintenance rather than structural change. The suffering is real, the practice reduces it, and the system that produces it remains intact. This is not an argument against meditation, but against treating individual psychological adjustment as a substitute for political action when the causes of suffering are structural. The structural analysis also raises a question about the distribution of responsibility for suffering. If suffering is produced by structures that no individual controls, who is responsible for reducing it? Young's answer, developed in her later work, is that responsibility is proportional to one's participation in and benefit from the structures that produce the suffering. Those who benefit most from structural arrangements that produce suffering bear the greatest responsibility for changing them, even if they did not intend and do not endorse the suffering those arrangements produce. We are now in a position to see the full scope of the question we began with. Why do we suffer? The answer is layered. We suffer because consciousness is valenced, because evolution built a system optimized for vigilance rather than contentment, because the self-model creates a subject to whom suffering belongs, because time gives suffering its characteristic endlessness, because the mind craves and the world disappoints, because social structures distribute the conditions of suffering unequally, and because no philosophical account has succeeded in justifying the amount and character of suffering that results. The final part asks what, if anything, remains settled. Part 16. What remains unsettled? We have moved through 16 dimensions of a single question, and it would be dishonest to end with a synthesis that implies resolution. What I can do instead is name the open questions precisely, locate them in the structure of the problem, and say where the live action is. First, the hard problem of valence. We do not know why experience comes with a positive or negative charge. Representational theories, desire theories, and adverbalist accounts each capture something, but none explains why there is felt badness rather than mere functional negativity. Until this is solved, every theory of suffering is built on a foundation it cannot inspect. Second, the causal efficacy of phenomenal suffering. Every evolutionary account of why suffering exists assumes that phenomenal experience does work that unconscious processing cannot. This assumption is not established and may not be establishable with current methods. If epiphenomenalism about consciousness turns out to be true, then the question of why we suffer becomes, why does this causally idle phenomenal overlay exist? And that question may have no answer at all, which would make suffering not a design feature, but a cosmic accident. Third, the relationship between self and suffering. Metzinger's framework suggests that suffering requires a transparent self-model, and pain, a symbolia, provides evidence for this. But the boundary between the minimal self-model required for suffering and no self-model at all is unclear. Where on the spectrum from bacterium to human does the self-model become rich enough to generate suffering? This question is of enormous practical urgency, given the expansion of our moral concern to animals, the possible sentience of AI systems, and the potential suffering of organisms we currently disregard. Fourth, the eliminability question. Can suffering be abolished without abolishing something constitutive of what makes life worth living? The debate between the hedonic engineers and the constitutive meaning theorists is active and unresolved. It depends on unresolved questions in the philosophy of value, specifically whether the goods that suffering may constitute, like love under conditions of vulnerability and knowledge under conditions of transformation, can survive the elimination of the suffering they seem to require. Fifth, the justification problem. No theodicy, secular or religious, has successfully justified the distribution and character of actual suffering. Levinas's prohibition on justifying the suffering of others remains, I think, the strongest position available, but it leaves us without a framework for comparing harms and making policy, which is something we must do even if we lack a philosophical warrant for doing so. Sixth, the structural dimension. Philosophical treatments of suffering that ignore social structure are incomplete, but integrating structural analysis with phenomenological and metaphysical analysis is methodologically difficult because the levels operate with different concepts, different evidence bases, and different normative vocabularies. A unified theory of suffering that bridges phenomenology, neuroscience, evolutionary theory, ethics, and political economy does not yet exist. Seventh, and most fundamental, the epistemic problem. We cannot know with certainty who suffers, how much, or what their suffering is like. Every moral claim about suffering rests on inferences about other minds that are philosophically contestable. We act on these inferences because we must, but the gap between our moral confidence and our epistemic position is one that philosophy has not closed and may never close. What we can say after this reconstruction is that the question, why do we suffer, is not one question but a family of questions spanning consciousness science, evolutionary biology, phenomenology, Buddhist and Western philosophy of mind, ethics, political philosophy, and population ethics. No single discipline owns the answer because no single discipline owns the problem. The fragmentation of the question is not a failure of understanding, but a reflection of suffering's actual structure, which is layered, multidimensional, and resistant to the kind of unification that elegant theories demand. The honest conclusion is that we suffer, at least in part, because we are the kind of beings for whom things matter. Valence, the felt goodness and badness of experience, is what makes us moral subjects and not mere information-processing systems. The same capacity that lets us love, create and find beauty in the world is the capacity that lets us be destroyed by loss, injury and despair. Whether this is a trade-off that can be renegotiated or a structural feature of conscious existence that must be accepted is, I believe, the deepest open question in the philosophy of suffering. And it is open.